A lot of empty seats here today, and typically I'm one of them. But the good news is that everybody who's here is one of my favorite people. This talk is called The Yes and No of Free Will. Sam Harris wrote a book called Free Will. I ordered it just so that I could see what other people had to say about the topic. Harris has a degree in philosophy from Stanford and a PhD in neuroscience from UCLA. He's the author of a handful of bestsellers. Harris considers free will to be a myth, but only 12% of philosophers agree with him. Do we have free will? It's a perplexing question, with very smart scientists, philosophers, and theologians answering either yes or no, and doing a good job of making their case. As I've stated in other talks, the answer to the most interesting questions is usually yes and no. This talk then looks into the yes and no of free will. Our ego is polarizing and sees the truth as something to possess. We can't possess the ambiguity of yes and no. We can only possess yes or no. I've always thought of defining terms as the beginning of a search for truth. Definitions. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines free will as a voluntary choice or decision, or the freedom of humans to make choices that are not determined by prior causes or by divine intervention. Pretty concise. The editors of the Encyclopedia Britannica says it is the supposed power or capacity of humans to make decisions or perform actions independently of any prior event or state of the universe. Often the study of something is assisted by the study of its opposite. The likely candidate for an opposite to free will is determinism, defined as every event in the universe being causally inevitable or predetermined. The reasons for this inevitability varies from one thinker to the next. Some say that our decisions are predetermined by our programming, the sum total of our experiences. Some say that things are predetermined by spiritual forces, such as God. Prophecy in the Bible is an example of that. Neuroscientists say that things are predetermined by brain chemistry and all the things that influence it. Others say that our decisions are at least partially determined by the laws of nature, such as the evolutionary drive to survive. Many philosophers through the ages have thought and argued that choices are the result of internal and external forces beyond our control. Many attorneys make this case when defending clients. Yes, my client is guilty, but there are extenuating circumstances, and therefore my client had no choice but to kill that person. Let's look at a specific situation. We've decided to go on a Sunday drive. We're exploring a road we haven't traveled before. On this drive, we come to a fork in the road and we have to decide. One way heads to the mountains, and we did want to see some scenic vistas. The other way heads to the valley, and we did have an urge for an ice cream cone. Thinking about how much we like ice cream influences our decision, and we head to the valley. Did my love of ice cream predetermine my choice? Our decision's basically about putting our preferences on a scale to see which one weighs more. It's not that simple. I mean, the doctor had just told me I was pre-diabetic, which I thought sounded ridiculous. So I asked if that was better or worse than pre-diabetic. I had brought my camera, and I did I really pay that much for a camera to take pictures of ice cream parlors? And what about my family history of diabetes? Now it's a decision between ice cream leading to having a foot chopped off or photographs that I'll probably never bore anyone with. What if I decided to have the ice cream today and go on the same drive next week and head to the mountains instead? If next week I go on that same drive, fully intending to turn toward the mountains, but thoughts of ice cream bring me back to that parlor, what does that say about my free will? What if this happens more and more until I'm sitting in that parlor contemplating that I don't really like my new prosthetic foot? And I wish I had more free will to make better decisions. We see in this scenario that free will might be in competition with our desire for comfort and pleasure. But what exactly are the competing forces? They are ego, the concept of self that's pretending to be us, and soul, the transcendent self. The soul is very vista-oriented. It wants to sit on the mountain, drinking in the majesty of all that is and being enlightened by the sense of oneness with natural beauty. The soul is our connection to the non-physical aspects of our existence. The ego is connected to the physical aspects of our existence, the sensory aspects. But always bear in mind that ego wants to be the king of our identity, and it protects its throne by co-signing our desire for physical comfort and pleasure. Mountains, schmountains, it says. Go get yourself some ice cream. The ego is the just do it aspect of our consciousness. Well, the soul is the big picture part of our consciousness, the vista part. Our ego doesn't want us to have the freedom to choose to be soul-oriented. The ego doesn't want us to be able to throw it off its throne. One of the ways of remaining on the throne is to grant permission for any whim without regard for negative consequences. Just do it. In our ice cream story, we see that valuing comfort and pleasure can undermine our free will. Another way of saying this is that our sensory capacity can undermine our free will. That ice cream tastes so good. What else gets in the way of free will? Emotions, but not in and of themselves. Emotions are problematic in our decision-making for the same sensory capacity reason. Emotions register in our body. They're part of our sensory capacity, and being such, we notice that some emotions feel good and some don't. Some emotions are comfortable and pleasurable, and some are uncomfortable and painful. Our polarizing, dualistic ego registers this as some good and some bad. But here's the thing. We unconsciously relate comfort and pleasure to survival, that strongest of natural drives. Our unconscious perception is that if we are comfortable and pleasured, we are safe. Because of this, we tend to make choices based on what will bring us the sensations of comfort and pleasure, or the emotions that translate into comfort and pleasure. This is notable in situations where another person is making a request that we want to say no to, but we say yes because yes feels less tense and confrontational. It's more comfortable to say yes. Our life experience may feel like it prohibits us from saying no when we need to, drastically limiting or eliminating free will. In this case, it is our personal psychology connected to our history of experience interfering with free will. Neuroscientists have regarded free will as a flawed concept, and they use technology, brain imaging, to make their case. Noting how the release of brain chemicals as a result of external stimuli can affect decisions, they see our choices as just another part of the mechanics of the material universe. I contend that it isn't really the external stimuli, but an internal reaction to external stimuli based on our internal interpretation. Our internal interpretation is based on our life experience. Our history has a huge influence over our decision making, and thus a huge impact on our free will. This is particularly true when we've not examined the faulty conclusions developed in that history. If we determine there is no free will, as Harris claims, would we be forced to conclude that it was unreasonable ever to praise or blame anyone for their actions, since they weren't truly responsible for deciding to do them? Might we come to feel that it was morally unjustifiable to mete out retributive punishment to criminals, since they had no ultimate choice about their wrongdoing? How might the absence of free will affect our criminal justice system? What if we determined that people were in fact conditioned to make the choices they made? It might cause us to look at our penchant for revenge. Harris offers an interesting example. An unsettling case against free will involves our first well-publicized mass shooting. In 1966, Charles Whitman drove to his mother's apartment and stabbed her to death. He then went home and killed his wife. Later that day, he went to the University of Texas and randomly shot and killed 12 people. He left a note saying he had no idea why he was doing these things, but he hoped an autopsy would find the answer. He apparently knew his actions would lead to his own death. It's easy to consider what a horrible person he was. But the autopsy revealed he suffered from a brain tumor pressing on the part of the brain that influences our fight or flight intuitions. The note implied that his prefrontal cortex was cognizant that the actions he was about to take were not rational. But none of that cognition was able to override the impulses emanating from his amygdala. Free will skeptics ask, if you find that the tumor excuses the man's behavior, seeing it as a symptom of a disorder, not an evil man doing evil things, then how is that different from all the other ways in which people's brains cause them to do things? We don't know for certain that the tumor caused Whitman's actions. We do notice that our perception of him shifts when we learn about the tumor. That shift doesn't mean that we change our minds about the police killing him to stop the rampage. Retribution is a central theme of our justice system. But how often is retribution also the central theme of crimes of violence? Aren't many criminals trying to even the score, however misguided their efforts and thinking are? With retribution as our primary justification for imprisonment and the horrible conditions of prison serving as a warning to others not to break the law, are we losing sight of the fact that the people we lock up will be more prone to violence after they get out? Many have been raped and beaten while locked up. Do we think that creates model citizens? One health advocate says that criminal justice should take a public health quarantine approach, where society would have no right to make the experience any more unpleasant than was necessary for public protection. We can argue that we have a choice not to give in to our worst impulses. We can feel the urge to kill someone without actually doing it. Happens to me all the time. Just when I'm driving. But in doing so, are we claiming that impulse control is an equal opportunity attribute? Are we in fact thinking that the experience of life is the same for everybody? Are we seeing the world through the lens of our ego and thinking that the lens is the same for everyone? There's a category of thinkers in the free will debate called compatibilist. They think that while there may be many determining or predictive influences over our choices, we are still free to make those choices. They're compatible with my yes and no view of free will. I see myself as a compatibilist, but I also see that there can be a huge difference among humans regarding our ability to sidestep the influences of our choices. What part do addictions play in our free will? Here, I'm not talking about drugs, but rather the broader category of any behavior that triggers the pleasure centers of our brain circuitry, with addiction being defined as the loss of control over that behavior. So far, we've looked at the hindrances to free will, our ego's use of comfort and pleasure to remain in control of our identity, our emotions and how the ego sorts them into good or bad, comfortable or pleasurable, our experiential history and the way it affects in the moment decisions, and all of it related to our unconscious assessment of comfort and pleasure equaling safety. We've looked at how all this affects the brain chemistry, which in turn affects decisions. And we've looked at how an illness like a brain tumor might be involved. There are two other questions that make the topic even more interesting. The first is, does God have free will? I think of God as pure consciousness, unadulterated with influences of ego. I believe pure consciousness would be the home of pure love, and that the two would create the impossibility of evil choices. So no, God would not be free to be evil. And that brings us to another question. Do we have to surrender free will to be spiritual beings? And I'm going to leave that question as something for you to contemplate. Namaste.